Hello, everyone, and welcome to another talk in terms of looking at World War I. So, to this point, we talked about the causes of World War I, then we talked about the battles and technology of World War I as we played the game diplomacy, and now we are looking at the outcomes of World War I. And I think I talked about this at the beginning of this unit that what is to come out of the end of World War I will directly lead to the start of World War II. And so we're going to look at that today, including the side consequence that we are seeing bear out just in the last couple years and today of the rise of the Soviet Union. So looking at an overall timeline, we of course start with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, and then a bunch of other countries coming in, including Russia, who declared war on Austria-Hungary, and then Germany declaring war on Russia, and France and Britain being pulled into this war as well. Okay? All of these things led to greater amounts of war. And to a smaller degree, we talked about and saw in our notes over the next couple of years from 1914 that Germany ends up provoking the United States on several occasions, leading to the United States coming into the war in 1917. So about 3 years into the war, the United States comes into the war. And with that, you see a huge turning point in the war, leading to the armistice, the end, of the war being signed in November of 1918. Okay, so just over a year and a half, the United States is in this war. Okay. And we're going to talk about what comes as part of the peace process and the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ends the war. So in terms of today, we're really going to see a couple essential understandings. The first one is that this war transformed not only Europe, but also American life. So for instance, because the war was fought in Europe, it wrecked the economies of Europe. It destroyed entire cities and really hurt the economy of Europe, like I said, over the next several years. And this would plant the seeds for a Second World War, and we'll see this over the coming days and weeks. The second one is that the League of Nations, which was set up to avoid, these type of conflicts in the future, was intended to provide a forum for resolving these international disputes. However, their effectiveness is not so great. And then the third one is the idea of the mandate system. And the mandate system is something we'll talk about in a few slides here, but it gave broad authority to the mandate powers regarding preparation for self-rule in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. So in terms of the outcomes and effects, a lot of colonies that we talked about within Africa and other areas of the world, like the Middle East and Asia, ended up participating a lot in the war. And because of this, they felt like they rightly deserved their independence. And so this led to increased demands for independence that would continue over the next 30 or 40 years. The next one is that there's an end to Russian imperial rule and the start of the Soviet Union. And we're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about the Russian Revolution later on in this section. But you also see the end of the Ottoman, the German, and the Austro-Hungarian empires as well. So unfortunately, if you played on those sides, they did lose at the end of the day. Okay. And then there were enormous costs of the war in lives, in property, in just the disruption of everything being geared towards war for 4 or 5 years. So we can see a before and after picture right here, and you can see a lot more countries that come out of the breaking up of these different territories. Now, in terms of looking at the end of the war, We mentioned that the treaty that ended the war was called the Treaty of Versailles. And this is based on the famous palace of Versailles that is in France. And the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept responsibility for the entire war. No one else had to accept this level of responsibility. And they had to lose territory, including part of it to Poland and other areas, and then also pay war reparations. So basically, they were blamed for everything in World War I. They have to pay the winning sides for the damages done. And this basically equaled to $269 billion. Now, within Germany at this time, there's been a lot of fighting already. And so a lot of Germany and their infrastructure has been destroyed by the war themselves. So in addition to rebuilding themselves, they also have to spend a lot of money that they didn't necessarily have. It also limited the German military, and they could have at most 100,000 men. They could no longer have a draft where people were forced to go serve in the German military. And they could also not have any tanks, submarines, or military airplanes. And this caused a lot of anger within Germany that they were blamed solely for the entire war. And this leads to, down the road, the ability of men like Hitler to come and build off of and take advantage of that anger towards other powers in the world, and led to him becoming in power. And obviously there's a lot more to that we'll talk about in the coming weeks and months. So here's just a couple political cartoons. You can see, really Germany is forced into this and is heavily weighed down by the reparations that they are forced to pay. Now, in terms of talking about the League of Nations, this was designed to be an international cooperative organization, sort of like the United Nations that we have now. It was really established to prevent future wars. However, even though the League of Nations was the idea of Woodrow Wilson, who was the United States president at the time, Congress vetoed the United States becoming a member of the League of Nations. And so because the United States, which had become a world power as a result of World War I, did not join the League of Nations, you start to see a failure for the League. Because not only did countries like the United States not become part of it, but it also did not have power within itself to enforce its decisions. And so that leads us down the path towards another world war. But you also, in other areas of the world, like Middle East and Northern Africa, see something called the mandate system put in place. And this was an agreement between Great Britain and France. And like we said at the beginning, the Ottoman Empire was ended officially because of World War I. It was broken apart. And so the areas that it controlled in the Middle East and somewhat in Northern Africa were now divided between these two powers. And it also put them on a path towards independence. Now, just like with Africa, you sort of see borders that are not perfectly aligned with who lives there. And so this leads to a lot of conflict down the road. And we're still, in some ways, a lot of the conflicts that we've seen go on between America and European powers and the Middle East and within the Middle East can be traced back a lot of times to this mandate system. Again, there are other factors, but the mandate system was quite a big part of this. And so we see here, not only in terms of the German reparations and the blame that Germany is, forced to feel, but also in terms of the mandate system, that a lot of these European powers, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, are sort of laying down the seeds towards future wars. And they could even see that back in the early 20s. So looking at this map again, um, there's quite a bit of change that goes on in Europe between 1914 and 1922. Not only in terms of Germany losing more territory, but also the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? So not only does Austria and Hungary become their own countries, but you also have other countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania becomes bigger. All of this changes because of the Treaty of Versailles and other agreements and changes within Europe. And you may have noticed that from 1914 to 1922, Russia also changes names. And this is a direct result of something called the Russian Revolution. And now, just in terms of a background, Russia had been an absolute monarchy. Okay, we talked about this a few units back, but this is when the king, or in the case of Russia, the Tsar, have absolute power. And this had gone on since 1547, right? So going and looking back all the way back to the time of the Renaissance that we looked at early on in the year. And over time, Russia was a poor, mostly agricultural society in which very few people held all of the power. And that starts to change over time. People start to question whether that is okay. And in 1905, there was a war called the Russo-Japan War, and the Japanese were able to defeat Russia. And this led to some political changes. People started to rise up and say, hey, what we're doing is not right. Okay? And where we're going and how we are able to be successful in society is not right. And so a revolution happened. However, it kept the Tsar in power. And going forward to 1917, during World War I, Russia ends up experiencing another political revolution called the Russian Revolution, which officially overthrew the monarchy and brought Russia into becoming the Soviet Union, a communist country. So in terms of just looking overall, really there's a couple causes of this revolution. For one, a lot of people within Russia were not happy about their involvement in World War I. And there was a high number of casualties, a lot of people died, there was a lot of economic costs, and this led to a lot of economic complaints that were ongoing even before the war, but the war just sort of made them worse, of workers and peasants. But you also have poor leadership from the Tsar, Nicholas II, who really did not show much regard for the anger that was being experienced by workers. And then you also have political disagreements between the military class and those in the military, and what was called the Duma, which was the Russian parliament. Okay, so these disagreements between government and the military. And in terms of just looking at some of the causes of this revolution, Russia has traditionally been a very difficult country to govern. It is very, very large. And you have, people that stretch from Europe to Asia. You have different climates. You have different areas. It's hard, especially at this time, in terms of technology, to be able to, and infrastructure, to be able to communicate and to transport people between these different areas. And really, Russia was just out of date. Okay? It was a farming economy. It had started to industrialize just a little bit. Okay? It was still operated by poor peasants who were not seeing enough of the rewards for being in this country. Okay? And really wars like the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 became a national embarrassment, and that only became worse after World War I. And so, like I said, Russia does begin to industrialize between 1863 and 1900, but it wasn't enough. Um, and even within these factory cities, you have workers who are paid very little. And there is a large concentration of them who are also becoming discontented with their status within society. And so, in addition to this, with the Industrial Revolution, you also have a small middle class beginning to develop, all of whom want a greater say in the government and who are not okay with an absolute monarchy like exists in Russia. Now, in terms of during World War I, even going into it, Russia was not ready to be able to pay for a war such as this. And you can see this in this picture right here, but a lot of people were starving. There was a worker shortage going on, there were food shortages going on, there was anger and unrest, and that's going into the war. Okay? And, the war takes 15 million men from these farms, from these factories, which exacerbates the problem of the worker shortage. Okay? And during the winters of 1916 and 1917, so during the time of World War I, they, in addition to that, have a famine in the cities. And so really the overarching idea is that Russia is not ready and not able to economically or militarily fight the war. And it's also an unequipped army or poorly equipped army. And so there are repeated defeats in World War I that continue to happen, which continue to lose the support of the Russian military. They feel like they've been basically put on an island, and they are not in a good position within the war due to their government. And so the military starts to turn on the Tsar. And so Russian deaths in these wars reach about 1.7 million. Now, just in terms of looking at casualties, the Civil War in the United States had about 600,000 casualties, so a third of the casualties. In addition to that, 4.9 million people are wounded, some of whom have lifelong injuries due to the war. So a grand number of people are being affected by this, not only those that fought, but also their families back home. And in addition to that, Tsar Nicholas II really has terrible leadership during this time. Okay? So Tsar Nicholas takes personal command of the army. They are a poorly equipped bunch by Tsar Nicholas's fault, and he is blamed for Russia's defeats. Okay? He's also a poor leader in the field. And while he's out there with the military, he leaves his wife, Alexandra, in charge of the government. And what Alexandra does is that she becomes and depends on closer to a man named Rasputin, who is pictured to the right. Okay? And Rasputin is a healer and a mystic. And he's become quite famous. I think one of the Kingsman movies has Rasputin in there. And Rasputin, again, like the name says, is a healer and a mystic. And so he is depending upon supernatural things in order to guide Russia. Now, at the same time, because of the food shortages, because of the poor leadership, in March 1917, you have riots in Petrograd, which is St. Petersburg today. And within a week, the army abandons the Tsar. The government loses control of the government of the country, and the parliament asks Tsar Nicholas, to abdicate or leave the throne. Okay, and so the Duma form a temporary government in his stead. And in addition to this, the Russians are leaving World War I. Now, in the middle of all this, Germany, who Russia is fighting, sends on a train in the middle of the night a man named Vladimir Lenin, who was a Russian who had been kicked out of Russia due to his, protesting the government. Okay? And he was a communist. and he led a group called the Bolsheviks. And these Bolsheviks, these communists, started to become the majority. And over the course of 1918 to 1920, in what is called the Bolshevik or the Russian Revolution, you have 14 million Russians that die in a civil war and an economic crisis. And in addition to all of the civilians who died, Tsar Nicholas and his family are also killed in this climate. Okay? And so Lenin, over time, and the Bolsheviks end up winning the Civil War and forming the first government that is based on communism in the history of the world. And so they rename Russia the Soviet Union, or the Union of the Soviet Socialist States. And just, looking at communism on the whole, it's an idea that was proposed by a German philosopher by the name of Karl Marx, and he believed in a classless and equal society. And so for those poor farmers and peasants, they look at this as a chance to have things be fair and equal. And so Lenin ordered that all farmland be distributed among the peasants, and they also gave control of the factories to committees set up by the workers, and they end up taking over as a government all personal property. And so these efforts in order to make Russia communist, or the Soviet Union, is called the New Economic Policy, and it was led by Lenin. And under this, peasants were able to sell their crops, but the government ended up keeping control of major industries like banks and communications. And this changes over time as well within Russia. So just looking overall at all of this, Lenin, because he wins and the Bolsheviks win, ends up organizing the country into 15 republics. And these are different Soviet states, which is where the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics comes into play, the USSR. And one of those states is Ukraine. And just to give a little bit more information, because I know we've been talking about this a lot in terms of the outside world, Ukraine was originally part of the USSR. Later on in 1990, when the USSR collapses, Ukraine becomes a free state that is separate from Russia. And that has led to some of the conflict that is going on as Russia attempts to bring under control some of these other countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. So with that being said, if you have any questions about either the outcomes of World War I or the Russian Revolution, please let me know. And have a good day.